The following talk was given at the Southern Consortium of Classical Educators in June of 2022. The Consortium of Classical Educators provides resources and regional connections for Christian families, teachers, and educational organizations to expand the reach of classical education and foster human flourishing for generations to come.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, everyone, for coming, and all those who have been working to put this event together. We're very grateful for this opportunity. Just to share with you, our heart in working with you here in Louisiana is basically the attitude of collaboration over competition. And I want to just take a second to talk about that for a moment. You've all probably heard the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, right? And we have a lot of great classical educators, institutions that are educating classically, that are fostering human flourishing in classical education. And we love every single, we partner with and work in different ways with Classical Academic Press, and SCOCE, and Classical Conversations, and then in local schools, just like Prudentia, and we have another consortium this year in New England, hoping to add one each year. And the goal of this is to foster classical education amongst the different classical educators and the different institutions who are working toward that end and working together in communities at a grassroots level, sort of like evangelists or missionaries, if you think about it, for classical Christian education. And part of what I'm going to talk about this morning has to do with this idea that we believe classical education really is the liberal arts education animated by Christianity, understanding what Christ has done and how it has animated the classical education that so many, like our founders all the way back through history, have had, that are free men and women who think well about the world and live virtuous and wisely. And so we want to foster that. We want to help in any way we can. And there's so many different approaches. And I'll talk a little bit about this in my talk, but with the broad umbrella of classical education, we have everything from, I think, an omnibus where you're drinking out of a fire hose, reading, students reading, 30-something, books a year, to SCOCE and slow, deep reading, and Charlotte Mason. There's a variety of approaches and understandings of the pedagogy. There are online institutions, there are brick and mortar schools, there are hybrid schools, and what we want to do is we, and homeschooling families are just outright, homeschooling or co-ops. What we want to do is help any way that you feel led of the Lord to homeschool or to be at a brick and mortar school to foster classical education. How do we help do that? And working together, I believe the Lord has a lot that He could do. He can do anything, but He will use classical education to bring back a cultural awareness and help our young people to grow up in the next generation and be free men and women. So we want to work together collaboratively, and I just want to say thank you, Heather, for allowing us to work with you here and to be a part of that. As Heather mentioned, Kepler is an online consortium of classical educators. And so if you're a classical educator and you're interested in being part of the consortium, we have a lot of different things to offer that are very helpful. So if you want to write, if you're a writer, a blogger, a curriculum writer, and you want to build an audience around something you're interested in, our consortium blog allows educators and homeschool parents to write and publish in a community blog called the Consortium. We have a consortium podcast. We do the brick and mortar conferences. And then we work with Roman Roads Media. We're actually all one company, but Roman Roads Media, who does all kinds of filming and curriculum development. And then Kepler Education is an online platform for educators to bring their course and teach it as an independent teacher. So what we've tried to foster there is a platform where a teacher who maybe you love to teach humanities or you love to teach physics, And this provides an opportunity for you to have exposure to other families, and then families have the opportunity to find your courses easier. So we're trying to be like a clearinghouse, or if you might think about it, we've talked about it in the terms of Airbnb for classical education, right? So you can find what you're looking for, and we help foster relationships and just trying to help classical education flourish. One of the giveaways that we're going to do today at the very end, we want to offer $600 of store credit, which is about the cost of many of our classes on the platform. And so we want to do that as our final giveaway today, and give you an opportunity to either, if you are already using Kepler, you want to add a student or a class, hopefully that'll be a help. If you want to try out what does online education look like, how would that actually work, then you have an opportunity to do that. One of the ways that we've been able to work together with Prudentia, and we've done this with so many other schools, is to provide, as schools are starting up, and we know the burdens of startup schools. We've done it twice, and small, schoolhouse kind of forum, and growing, and then all the growth pains that come with that. And sometimes you have enough students, you need a class, but at the same time, you don't have enough money to pay the teacher to come in and teach that class. And so an online teacher can host it, can provide a class, and they can work through the school to provide that class. So you have a kind of outsourcing that particular class, but it's being outsourced to a teacher that fit a primary category that the school has vetted. And all of our teachers on the Kepler platform are Christians. We have a mere Christian presentation. If you can ascribe to the Nicene Creed, you're welcome. And then we have a few social things that probably 10 years ago we wouldn't have had to lay out for Christians. We believe that a man should be married to a woman, and that is defined by gender, by God, and birth, some of those kind of normalized questions. So that the teachers that are on the platform are going to be solid Christian people. Then they also have a statement of teaching philosophy. And so know where their faith tradition is, what their teaching philosophy looks like, and it has to be under that umbrella of classical education. And finally, what we call Burkean or historical conservative. And that's a kind of a loaded word, so I always want to be careful to qualify that. That's not talking about a political affiliation with any political party. Burkean conservatism, recognized Edmund Burke, if you know the name, understands that reality has certain contours, that we live in a cosmos, and progress must be progressed along certain contours as God has designed by His providence. So we might think of things like natural law or God's providence in the cosmos. So you have to understand and recognize that we can't just go changing the world arbitrarily like they did in the French Revolution and make 7-day calendars into 10-day because we think that we are God. So that's what we mean by a Burkean conservative. So that the teachers on the platform ascribe to each of those at the very least, which usually rules out most everybody who is not a classical Christian educator. So that's what we're doing, and so I'm very thankful for the opportunity to share this time with you today, and I wanted to let you know about that. Also, we have just begun, this is another part of the consortium, we just issued, our very first issue came out this summer in June, the next edition will come out in December, but we are publishing a brand new academic journal of classical Christian education. And in this particular edition, everyone should have received one, so if you didn't get one when you registered or when you came in, please be sure to stop by the table and get one. Louis Marcos published an article in here reuniting the trivium and quadrivium, and I think Tricia is going to be speaking about something like that today in one of her workshops, and so that would be a great workshop to look at if you're thinking about those things. Daniel Fukushima, our CEO, published, this is part of his master's thesis, and he published a brief history of the SAT, and so why education in the modern world has shifted to the way it is, and he shows you, he goes back through the historical process, and basically starts in World War I when you have to process a whole bunch of people through, to find out what their competencies are, and then that became the standard way that we test everybody. So he discusses some of those things. Dr. Kristen Vaughn has an article in here, and this article that she's written, this paper, is a research article that she's done. It's been published in another journal already, and she does a summary review, an executive review of it, but they compare classical Christian education with public school education, and they look at the PSAT scores, and they show how classically educated students, fare far superior. And so this kind of information isn't necessarily what, as a homeschool parent, everybody's always worried about, but in terms of a student going to college and somebody looking at classical education from the outside wanting to know, how do classically educated students fare if they go to a classical Christian school and they graduate? Can they compete and function in the real world, as they might say? And so this has a lot of solid information that is, it's academic, it's scholarship, it's empirical, so it's not just somebody talking about it. Dr. Robert Woods, he is writing a book that we're publishing this next year, this article on redeeming the social sciences. So anyone who's been in classical education for any time knows that in the social sciences, we always focus, they focus on the what is, right? We want to look at what are the economic trends, what are the cultural trends, and there's no sort of ought to it. And Dr. Woods talks about ways, he's been a classical educator for over 20 years. He ran the PhD program at Faulkner University in the great books. And he talks about how we can, in the classical renewal movement, how we can redeem the social sciences, how we can use them in a way that is both glorifying to God and beneficial to education. And so many other some great articles in there. But this journal is a little more than just a book. It's academic research, and so we're hoping to try to foster it. It is not an officially peer-reviewed journal, and so we toyed with that, but Brian Williams with Principia, they are putting out a journal, and I would look into that, and they're going through the full peer review process. We do an internal peer review process with the Board of Academic Advisors, but we wanted to complement what they're doing and not compete with what they're doing. So we're looking forward to that issue that's supposed to come out this summer. And so this looks a little bit more at a populist level. So if that makes sense in terms of academics. So we're wanting to find ways that in classical education we can help foster it if we can. So just a couple words about that. All right. Well, I want to open this morning talking about one of my all-time favorite movies ever. And I think I've seen this film, probably at least a dozen, if not 20 times, I think. The Princess Bride. Now, here's the unfortunate thing. I'm going to tell myself as an educator, and in the bio that Heather read, I am a practitioner of Sudoku, sorry. And I think probably many of you are also. Does anybody know what that is? Anybody practice that ancient art? It's a Japanese word meaning you buy more books than you'll ever read in a lifetime. Right? That you buy books and they pile up with you intending to read it. There's an actual word for it. Now you know what that word is. And so Goldman's book is on my shelf. It's one of those that I know I will get to one day, that I haven't read it yet, but I've watched the film Princess Bride probably 20 times. Anybody seen it? All right, wonderful. Good. We're in good company. Well, actually I started wrong. That's in my second talk. I was going to talk about Vizzini, but I'll just tell you, Vizzini says inconceivable. So, when we think about what is, oh no, that's the right one. Sorry, I just opened the wrong one. Here we go. I am right. All right, so William Goldman's The Princess Bride, Vizzini gets into the habit of saying inconceivable, right? And then Inigo Montoya comes along and says, you keep using that word, but I don't think it means what you think it means, right? It's the classic line. And this sort of sums up what a lot of people think about when they hear you say something about liberal arts education, right? So when you talk about that, people are like, liberal arts education, that sounds kind of strange, and maybe, if I understand it correctly, maybe how you're using it, maybe it even sounds a little bit icky. Well, in an article in The Classical Difference, David Goodwin illustrates this very point when he likened his very first encounter with the term unto finding a treasure in the mud, he said, that needed cleaning off. He says, my mind locked immediately on an unfortunate image, liberal as opposed to conservative, arts as a euphemism for joblessness, and education, a hoop-jumping, time-passing exercise that consumes the first quarter of your life. And so the question then is, what actually is a liberal arts education? And in general, liberal arts refer to the medieval education model, that's usually comprised of seven, and in one period, some of the educators actually put forth an argument for 9 liberal arts, but typically we think of 7. And they're bifurcated into the trivium and the quadrivium, the 3 paths and 4 paths. You're aware of that? The trivium consisting of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and what was considered the lower or foundational division of a liberal arts education. And the quadrivium consisted of arithmetic, which is pure number, geometry, which is number in space, music, which is number in time, and astronomy, which is number in space and time. And the quadrivium was considered the upper division of learning. But as many, like James Shaw said in his book, The Life of the Mind, have both argued and demonstrated, a liberal arts education is much more than an educational structure, although it's not less than one. One way to define a liberal arts education is to analyze the nomenclature itself. The word liberal is derived from the Latin word libere, meaning freely. More specifically, it comes from the Latin adjective, liberalis, meaning freedom, of free citizens, gentlemanly, honorable, generous, liberal, handsome. As one can see from the etymology of the adjective, a liberal education is the education of free people, the education of a free society. And Shaw aptly points out in his work that certain disciplines, particularly what is known from Aristotle as metaphysics, are called freeing subjects. Such liberal discipline is undertaken for its own sake. That is, the purpose of the knowledge gained is not to do anything with it, just to know something is itself a pleasure. And this is where a lot of folks get tripped up with liberal arts education. What are you going to do with this education, right? In other words, liberal refers to the fact that there is such a kind of knowledge in which humanity, if such humanity is to govern themselves as free men, as opposed to slaves, ought to know for the sheer pleasure of knowing it. And elsewhere he explains what in essence this knowledge consists of. The liberal arts are not one person's invention, but rather represent the collective wisdom of many generations and nations. We should recognize from the beginning that these freeing or liberal arts are not simply a body of books to read, but a way of life that enable us to be free enough to know the truth of things. And so we can say the liberal arts are actually a way of life. And John of Salisbury, as we'll look at in a moment, breaks this down even further for us. The word art, then, is derived from the Greek word techne, and it means craft or trade. You can notice the word technology, right? It comes from that word techne. The idea of an art, in this sense, might best be described as the tools and skills free people need to create meaningful and purposeful lives. As David Goodwin notes 200 years ago, art was simply anything created by a human for a purpose. Very useful and beautiful stuff. But the specific category of liberal arts, then and now, speaks of the set of tools used by free men to lead and live wisely. Now, of course, we know that in modern conversations, the usefulness of art is a hotly debated topic. That's a discussion for another time. Art, in the classical Christian tradition or the liberal arts tradition, is that skill that we need for living and thinking wisely. Now finally, the word education might just be the most misunderstood of all the words. Why you think, well, education, I know what the word education means. Education, as Shaw notes, is often associated with job training. So when you say education to the average person on the street and ask about education or talk about education, the image that comes to their mind is job training. What are you going to do to get a kind of job, skill, or career in your future? And here's how it sort of works. If I said to you this morning, I saw a dog rolling around in the grass this morning when I pulled in. Can you imagine that? I'm wondering what kind of dog you imagine. And so if I said that and you were imagining that little scenario in your mind, maybe you thought of a Labrador, or maybe you thought of a poodle or a German Shepherd. But probably everyone had some conception, some phantasm of what kind of dog it looked like. And if we were all, if we were all perfect artists, or we could take a snapshot of what we imagined and put them all out for everybody to see, we would probably see a little bit different variations of different dogs that people would imagine. Well, the same thing happens with the word education, because it has been cultivated in our culture to think about it as job training. But in Platonic terms, an education is to be delivered from the cave of images where the true light of the sun illuminates what is real. Additionally, to be educated is to know and to be able to articulate truth. But it is not only to know what the truth is, says Shaw, and not only to be able to articulate what the truth is, and this is very important, but also to be able to explain the false views, and to know what it is to be unintelligent and vicious. This is, Shaw explains, a considerable part of being intelligent and virtuous, of being educated. So it's not only to know what the truth of things are, to know what reality looks like, but also to know what it would look like to fall out of virtue into vice, and to know what it looks like to fall away from reality into that which is not true. In sum, the expression liberal arts education isn't inconceivable, neither in concept nor in possibility, but as the ancients duly noted, it can be painful, and not everyone will be inclined to pursue one, especially those who think it means something that it does not mean. So without further qualification, I want to continue from the presupposition this morning that, generally speaking, and this is going to sound a little bit like a contradiction here, modern classical Christian education, right? What we're talking about in the renewal, this period from about the 1980s until now, the renewal of classical Christian education, in the modern parlance, classical Christian education is the recovery of the liberal arts tradition. And I would include in there also the humanities, and there is a difference between a liberal arts and humanities in a technical sense. As it was animated by Christianity, by the biblical view of creation, the natural order of the cosmos, and by the gospel of Jesus, that is the incarnation, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Both parts of the incarnation and what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 is the gospel, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. These play into what is a classical Christian education. And I'm going to unpack a little bit more of that in the breakout session. But I want to note one example here of what we mean when we think of classical Christian education in the modern sense as a recovery of the traditional liberal arts animated by Christianity. We could almost say that to say classical Christian education is redundant, almost. Okay? Because there are expressions of classical education that treat Christianity as though, it were another philosophy, Stoicism, Epicureanism, those kinds of things. But true classical education, animated by Christianity, that which changed and brought about the Western tradition, you cannot separate the fact that it was animated by Christianity. That all that the ancients groped for, Paul says in Acts 17, Christ brought down to us. So while the ancients were groping and failed, they couldn't get there. Plato, for example, when you read the Republic, I find it so fascinating that Plato takes his interlocutors through this discussion, and I'm going to sum up, the Republic in these words. He says that the philosophers should rule because they love wisdom, and if you know they're just, if they suffer the most injustice without ever being unjust themselves, if you ever find that person, make him your king. So imagine for just a moment that without realizing it, Plato certainly did not have Jesus in mind, but there's a sense in which Plato's groping, and if you could find this person, these are the people who should be king over the city. And there's a sense in which the ancient world is prepared to receive a sort of Messiah, and I use that word a little bit more metaphorically than the Jews received their Messiah. But there is an anticipation that is fulfilled in Christianity, and as David Hicks notes in Norms of Nobility, the Christian paideia is what fulfilled and brought about what the pagan paideia just lacked. They just couldn't get there. How do we get this? We see how it can be achieved, but we just keep falling short. Well, because you have the sin nature that Jesus took care of. All right, so since the liberal arts traditionally or arguably reached their zenith in the Middle Ages, I want to turn to one of the most influential educators of that period and sort of unpack a little bit as an example. In 1159, John of Salisbury, who was the secretary and counselor to Thomas Becket. Some of you may know that name. Thomas Becket was the renowned Archbishop of Canterbury who lost his head to Henry II. His secretary, John of Salisbury, published an influential treatise on education called Metallogicon. Literally means about logic. He drew heavily from the works of classical antiquity along with patristic and medieval Christian writers. Metallogicon is said to be the cardinal treatise of medieval pedagogy, a classic in the history of educational theory and a landmark in several fields of learning, including philosophy, theology, psychology, and education. In this cardinal treatise, John begins laying the foundation by advocating for a harmonized education on the grounds that the universe is intelligently created and ordered by a triune God. He writes, "The creative Trinity, the one true God, has so arranged the part of the universe that each requires the help of the others, and they mutually compensate for their respective deficiencies, all things being members of one another." He's saying that the universe that God created is one that has various working parts, each with its own purpose and function, and it has been so arranged as to be mutually dependent to help, dependent on the help of the other parts, and then contributing where they are superior to the parts of the deficiencies of the other part of the universe. And this understanding of the cosmology echoes the ancient understanding of the human soul, particularly as Plato outlined it. That is, the soul is virtuous when the noetic and the spirited and the appetitive are all working in harmony. And so the noetic, the ancients believe, the noetic nature, we sometimes think of this as the head, right? This is where wisdom resides. This is where reason resides, And the problem, though, with cerebral logic is that it's very weak, right? So when you're looking at that second piece of chocolate cake and you're thinking, it probably would not do me well to have that second piece of chocolate cake, and your appetitive nature is like, oh yeah, it would, right? And so usually, unless something intervenes, the appetitive is going to overpower the cerebral. I know what I ought to do, Paul says, but I don't always do that. So there's something in the ancients that they recognized the ordering of the soul was so important. The noetic nature is where reason lies, and it has the task of guiding and directing. The appetitive nature, or the passions, where we feel and where we desire, often demonstrated in the ancient world as the bed and the table, is much stronger than the noetic nature, and it tends to overpower reason. The spirited nature, where discipline and courage resides, is strongest of all, and it must be employed to keep the passions in check with wisdom. So the noetic, the Greek word for the spirited, is the thymotic, and the appetites are the epithymotic. And so in modern parlance, or put it in C.S. Lewis's words, the well-ordered soul, the head rules the belly through the chest. Okay? That's the way that John of Salisbury saw the universe as being in harmony with the soul of man, the soul of man being in harmony with the universe as he looked at both of these. So harmonized education is an education that cultivates the soul according to its natural order, where the proclivities of its various natures reflect the created order, where each of the parts are members one of another, functioning in a complementary role. And John provides an example of this when defending the necessity of cultivating eloquence in those with a natural proclivity for speaking. He says, just as natural ability easily deteriorates when neglected, so it is strengthened by cultivation and care. The terms of cultivation and care, of course, reflect the vocation of husbandry, where germination of plant life is natural, but with the help of a husbandman, tilling, watering, fertilizing, and weeding, the plant yields more bounty. So it is when sound instruction and the practice of an art is so ordered that it works in harmony with the natural inclinations and proclivities of the person. It yields more abundance of knowledge and understanding, and in turn, an abundance of virtue and wisdom. Now, John explains it this way. Natural ability is an immanent power infused in one's soul by nature. Although it proceeds from nature, it is fostered by study and exercise. This is the way the soul is supposed to work. It echoes the cosmos, but we have to foster that. We have to account for what we call sin nature. The importance of an approach that cultivates the soul in harmony with the created order is so fundamental to John's understanding of education. He makes this very bold assertion. Whoever tries to thrust asunder what God has joined together for the common good should rightly be adjudged a public enemy. If John of Salisbury were to look at the pedagogy of classical education and look at modern pedagogy of education, he would say that is a public enemy. That kind of education is not good for humanity, therefore it should be pushed out. In the modern world, Robert Hutchins rightly recognized that the aim of this liberal arts or classical education is human excellence, both private and public. For a man, he says, is a political animal, calling on Aristotle. Its object is the excellence of man and man as citizen. It regards man as an end, not a means, and it regards the ends of life and not the means to it. It's for this reason that it's the education of free men. Other types of education or training treat men as means to some other end, or are at best concerned with the means of life, with earning a living and not with its ends. The substance of liberal education appears to consist in the recognition of basic problems, in knowledge of distinctions and interrelations in subject matter, and in the comprehension of ideas. He goes on to say much more about liberal education, but he sums up saying that the liberal arts are not merely indispensable, they are unavoidable. He says nobody can decide for himself whether he's going to be a human being. The only question open to him is whether he'll be an ignorant, undeveloped one, or one who has sought to reach the highest point he is capable of attaining. The question, in short, is whether he will be a poor liberal artist or a good one. Continuing to operate with the assumption that classical Christian education is a liberal education animated by Christianity, classical Christian education, as expressed in the modern renewal, has begun to flourish under a fairly broad tent of thought, and there are likely as many micro-persuasions as there are eyes on Argos. And this is true for at least three reasons. First, what we call classical Christian education today has looked differently in different epochs of history. So depending on who is answering the question, what is a classical Christian education, one may get a slightly different answer if they're focusing on pre-Christian classical education, on classical education as it functioned during the scholastic period, as classical education that functioned during the Renaissance period, or classical education that functions in this modern period of classical Christian renewal that began in the early 1980s, or in what some are now calling Christian classical education. So there's lots of different nuances depending on what period we're talking about and which development in the renewal that we're talking about. The second reason there is some diversity here is that during the modern age of recovering classical education, educators have continued to grow in their own understanding of what classical Christian education is. For example, in the work, The Liberal Arts Tradition, published, CAT, right? Liberal Arts Tradition, written by Kevin Clark and Robbie Jane, the author suggests there have been 4 periods of growth in the classical Christian education movement. And if you haven't read that, the 3rd edition is fabulous. I highly recommend it. The third reason is directly related to the first two, as understanding has grown about what classical Christian education has been and how it was implemented in ages past. So have opinions about which historical expression is most important to recover in the modern world. For example, do students in the modern world still need to study Latin to be classically educated? Wouldn't studying modern languages do just as well? Also, where does the study of subsidiary sciences like biology and ecology, where do these fit into classical Christian education? In a nutshell, while classical Christian education is a historic tradition of education that stands in opposition to the modern progressivist pedagogy and agenda, we must recognize the tradition is mildly dynamic, developing over more than 2 millennia of Western civilization, and a truly classical Christian education is one that strives to glean the best of Western liberal education in every epoch. So how is classical Christian education defined? How do we define it? The Association of Classical Christian Schools, ACCS, provides one of the most concise definitions. It says that classical Christian education is a time-tested educational system which establishes a biblical worldview called Paideia, incorporates methods based on natural phases of student development, cultivates the 7 Christian virtues, trains students reasoning through the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and interacts with the historical great books. If you look at the website, thewelltrainedmind.com, they give a far more expansive definition, but they summarize it this way. A classical education then has 2 important aspects. It is language focused, and it follows a specific 3-part pattern. The mind must be first supplied with facts and images, then given the logical tools for organization of facts, and finally equipped to express conclusions. While these definitions are both accurate and sound as far as they go, neither mention an essential aspect of classical Christian education, the quadrivium, the second half of the 7 liberal arts. Further, what is accurately mentioned still requires some unpacking to more fully answer the question, what is classical Christian education? So I would like to conclude by just giving the following 7 characteristics that I believe all expressions of classical Christian education share. And I present this information, I present it this way, hoping to give us some language in which we can express and some boundaries and contours in which we can kind of capture this idea as we talk about it, as we talk to, if you're in a school and you're talking to parents, how do we talk to parents about it? If you're talking to others who are asking about it, how do we talk about it? How do we think about it? How does this thinking about it shape our own educational projects and pedagogy and choices of curriculum? So the first characteristic of a classical Christian education is the development and cultivation of Paideia. Paideia is a word whose etymology can be recognized in words like pediatrics or pedagogy. In his letter to the saints at Ephesus, St. Paul writes, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Ephesians 6:4. The word translated discipline here is the Greek word paideia, and it's defined as the act of providing guidance for responsible living, upbringing, training, and instruction, chiefly as it is attained by discipline or correction. I want to pause here to say something about the word paideia. The word paideia was so commonplace in the Greek world because it was applied to civics. Paideia was the raising of your children to be a good citizen in your polis. How does this work in your city-state? And so raising your children to be committed this way. When Paul adds the prepositional phrase, to raise up your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, he's talking about a different kingdom. The paideia by which we raise up our children are not for the kingdom of this worldly state, but for the kingdom of God. But he uses the word that would have been commonplace to understand the education of a child. But he qualifies it by saying, our children need to be raised for the kingdom of the Lord. So definitions, continuing on, it's a word that is related to the word translated discipline in the same verse, nouthesia. Nouthesia is the opposite. It means counsel about avoidance or cessation of an improper course of conduct, an admonition. So the nurture and admonition, the paideia and nouthesia of the Lord. You want to, here's what you should do, and here's what you shouldn't do. Right? These are the contrasts in training of our children. So definitions are noted to draw attention not only to the denotation of paideia, but also its connotations. It reveals the fundamental nature of education, the rearing of a young person in a proper view of the world. That is a worldview that guides the way he should go, Proverbs 22:6. Now, while the word worldview brings its own set of baggage to the conversation, it is used here to mean thinking Christianly about the world in which we live and move and have our being. A young person with a Christian worldview possesses a comprehensive vision of the cosmos as having been created and being redeemed by God. He or she also possesses a moral imagination informed first by the truth of Scripture, but also by the noble traditions of the church. This idea of a Christian worldview falls into the stage of education called piety. We'll talk about some of the different stages that Clark and Jane unpack. The second characteristic of a classical Christian education is its focus on a liberal or humane education. In opposition to the modern and slavish approach to training mere workers for an institutionalized and crony capitalist society, classical Christian education seeks to educate the whole person. It's a human qua human education. Recall that this is where libere in the liberal arts refers to a classical Christian education is the education of a liberated man. And I use man here as homonym versus vir, talking about mankind. Or the education that makes for a full and free human being. Regarding education oriented to job training in a world where vocations ebb and flow like the tide, John Gardner, who's the author of a book called Excellence, 19th century or early 1900s actually, early 20th century, somewhere in there. This is written, it's out of print today. But he noted this: we don't even know what the skills may be needed in the years ahead. That is why we must train our young people in the fundamental fields of knowledge and equip them to understand and cope with change. That is why we must give them the critical qualities of mind and durable qualities of character that will serve them in circumstances that we cannot now even predict. And how much more true is that today than it was at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century? Who knows what job fields are going to look like, but the student who understands the way the world works will be able to acclimate to any kind of technology or job market. The ability to rightly cope with change can only be accomplished by receiving a liberal arts education. John of Salisbury, who I mentioned previously, stated, "The liberal arts are said to have become so efficacious among our ancestors, who studied them diligently, that they enabled them to comprehend everything they read, elevated their understanding to all things, and empowered them to cut through the knots of all problems possible of solution." A classical Christian education doesn't spoon-feed children what to think, although part of that is in the worldview formation, but also teaches them literally what we talk about how to think right about the world, how to exercise their thinking muscle so that whatever they read, however they look at things, they can become aware and they can read and understand and become autodidactic. That is one of the benefits of a liberal arts education. And to the point of educating the whole person, remember what Robert Hutchins said, nobody can decide for himself whether he's going to be a human being. The only question open to him is whether he'll be an ignorant, undeveloped one, or one who has sought to reach the highest point of he's capable of attaining. So far we've said that characteristic of classical education is the development and cultivation of paideia, and it is also focused on a liberal or humane approach to education. The third characteristic, and I'm going to move a little quickly here to wrap these last ones up. The third characteristic of the classical Christian education is a pedagogical method that follows the order of the medieval 7 liberal arts, mainly as it relates to a child's development, but also as an approach to teaching all subject matter. We've already discussed the 7 liberal arts as described by the medieval divines as the trivium, the 3 ways, and the quadrivium, the 4 ways. So first we follow the trivium. Students learn grammar, the language of any subject, or language in general. Then the dialectic, or logical thinking. And then finally the rhetoric, or the way to express oneself accurately and persuasively, knowing what you can say about anything. And before moving on to studying the quadrivium, which treats the 4 universal truths of number, geometry, harmony, and astronomy. Early in the modern renewal of classical Christian education, those seeking to recover the classical model of education relied on an essay by Dorothy Sayers titled The Lost Tools of Learning. It was an extremely helpful essay, and many schools adopted her pedagogical model, but the recovery didn't stop there. In the midst of repairing the ruins, more about classical pedagogy was uncovered, and to lean on a tired trope, Sayers' pedagogical insights were just the tip of the iceberg. Recovery of classical pedagogy also revealed just how important poetic knowledge was to the formation of the whole person. Today, most will recognize a much fuller expression of classical Christian education that was first laid out by Ms. Sayers and referred to by Clark and Jane as, and I'm going to give you this paradigm, and they unpack it in the liberal tradition, PGMAPT. Okay? So these are, and all this is an acrostic, okay? PGMAPT. And it means piety, gymnasium, music, liberal arts, philosophy, and theology. A in the paradigm there stands for the liberal arts, trivium and quadrivium, and the 7 liberal arts are bookended by poetic knowledge on one end, and then the modern consummate studies on the other, more specific sciences. But there is a progress that the ancients recognized in pedagogy. So in some sense, all classical education has an understanding of this kind of pedagogy. The 4th characteristic recognizes the pedagogical approach must be applied to something. It's not just an approach to anything or to nothing. There is more than a pedagogy. It's a pedagogy applied to a specific pool of knowledge. And we can sum that pool of knowledge up by calling it the best of what has been thought and written in the last 2.5 millennia of the Western tradition. Sometimes this pool is called the Western canon, or sometimes it's referred to as the great books. And when we refer to the great books, you might immediately think of Mortimer Adler's 60-volume set published by the University of Chicago and Encyclopedia Britannica. But here's a myriad collection of the kinds of works to which the great books refer. While it's a good collection, it's also an incomplete collection. The president of Harvard College, Charles Eliot, suggested his own list of similar books, which have been affectionately come to be known as the 5-foot shelf. They were published as the Harvard Classics. Roman Roads Media has their own approach to the great books called Old Western Culture. You can look at a couple of copies out on the table up there, but they have a whole series as well, including books that were not in Mortimer Adler's that lean heavily more on the patristic fathers. Classical Christian education makes a point of exposing students to these primary sources in an integrated fashion, finding in both the classical and Christian traditions that all truth, that is reality, is part of a whole. In other words, knowledge of any subject is only a partial knowledge of the one truth.
Instead of studying textbooks or disintegrated subjects like social studies, history, or English, in a classical Christian education, students study the humanities in an integrated manner. And this means they read and discuss in Socratic fashion the best primary literature, philosophy, theology, and history, often within a given period, historical period. The fifth characteristic of classical Christian education is the study of classical languages, including Greek and especially Latin. While a few have made a somewhat meritorious argument of substituting Latin with modern languages, I believe there are many stronger arguments for the continued inclusion of classical languages in a classical Christian education. And I want to give you just briefly a few of those. First, learning Latin gives the students the ability to read many important primary sources in Latin. You all heard the joke that reading poetry and translation is like kissing through a veil, right? And so the same is true when you read translations of work. There's something beautiful and delightful and beneficial about reading it in its original language. It's the language in which they're written. It also affords the opportunity to read texts that have not yet been translated into English. Learning Latin provides students with a fuller understanding of the English language, since about 40% of English is derived from Latin. We could say English is Anglo-Saxon, heavily filtered through with Latin. And then, of course, a few other spices added into it, like some of the Romantic languages integrated into our Germanic Anglo-Saxon. Many of the professional vocations still do and probably always will rely heavily on Latin languages, because it is in that period when these terms were developed, when Latin was the primary language of the educated. You had the provincial languages, but if you were in law or medicine or theology in the seminary, Latin was the language everyone spoke. And so today, many of the terms and the terminology and the language is rooted heavily in Latin. And then one ancillary and pragmatic reason is that students who study Latin overwhelmingly score higher on standardized tests than students who have not studied Latin. In any case, classical Christian education emphasizes the learning of not only modern languages, but the classical languages as a fundamental staple of the person's education. The sixth characteristic is teaching students with the goal of fostering virtue and wisdom instead of helping them merely accumulate disconnected facts or skills for the job market. And while modern education takes what it claims to be a secular approach, wrongly believing that education can only consist of the is and not the ought, classical Christian education emphasizes what a student ought to be: virtuous. By highlighting what David Hicks, in Norms of Nobility, another great read if you haven't, I would highly recommend, calls the tyranny of the ideal image. This ideal image is exemplified by the 7 Christian virtues: prudence, fortitude, wisdom, justice, faith, hope, and love, and also is revealed in the person of Jesus Christ, Ephesians 4:11-16. Finally, the seventh and last characteristic I want to give you has already been alluded to in relation to at least 2 other characteristics, namely that students read primary sources and classical languages are essential. However, it'd be remiss not to emphasize the fact that classical Christian education is a language-focused rather than image-focused learning. Now, it doesn't mean that classical Christian education excludes the classic arts like painting and sculpting and those sorts of things, the fine arts that go with it. But it's quite the contrary. It simply means that it emphasizes language-based learning. In other words, classical Christian education emphasizes learning through words written and spoken rather than through videos or other types of imaging. And I want to qualify here, there's nothing wrong with using video and imaging in a supplementary manner to education. That's not the point. So we're not saying don't use that or it's not classical education. We're saying its emphasis, its source is in the verbal, the written and spoken languages. And I want to just conclude here with this short excerpt from Dorothy Sayers' essays, The Lost Tools of Learning, because I think it's apropos not only for the entire enterprise of recovering classical Christian education, especially in a world dominated by pixels, but it's also very apropos to this 7th characteristic. Here's what she says. By teaching them all to read, we have left them at the mercy of the printed word. By the invention of the film and the radio, we have made certain that no aversion to reading shall secure them from the incessant battery of words, words, words. They do not know what the words mean. They do not know how to ward them off or blunt their edge or fling them back. They are a prey to words in their emotions instead of being the masters of them in their intellects. We who were scandalized in 1940 when men were sent to fight armored tanks with rifles are not scandalized when young men and women are sent into the world to fight mass propaganda with a smattering of subjects. And when whole classes and whole nations become hypnotized by the art of the spellbinder, we have the impudence to be astonished. We dole out lip service to the importance of education, lip service, and just occasionally a little grant of money. We postpone the school, leaving age and the plan to build bigger and better schools. The teachers slave conscientiously in and out of school hours, and yet, as I believe, all this devoted effort is largely frustrated because we have lost the tools of learning, and in their absence, can only make a botched and piecemeal job of it. I intended to leave you with just this statement and to meditate on Dorothy Sayers' words, but as Lord's providence would have it, yesterday we all know there was a wonderful, mighty upset in our nation as Roe versus Wade was overturned. Amen? That was wonderful. Now, I can't think of a better illustration to what Dorothy Sayers is talking about than to look at Roe versus, I was 2 years old when Roe versus Wade, when Roe was implemented, and then it was undone now. When I look at the generation of my children's generation and their children's generation, there is among young people this belief system. And we're seeing it all over the social media now, in a democratic state, you have a democratic access to your voice. It's the young people saying our health care is being taken away from us. There's been propaganda for 2 generations purported and streamed into the mindset of this generation to believe something so incessantly wicked is a good. And we wonder, how will they ever be equipped to think otherwise? This is, to them, it's normal. So while we can get frustrated and to think, how could they ever come up with this? To them, it's the words, the words, the words. It's the streaming that she's talking about, without any way of knowing how to fling back these things. How do we recognize where fallacies exist? Well, it's classical Christian education. This is the focus. And I hope today that through these different talks and getting to have conversations with the different educators here, that we can help foster this classical Christian education here in Louisiana and all around the nation. God bless you. Thank you for your time.